Hello, my name is Erica from thetrailtohealth.com, and I'm so excited to have a special guest here with us. I have Stuti Vora from IGeneX, and she's here to share some of her amazing knowledge in the world of Lyme testing. Stuti, I'm so happy for you to be here. I'm very excited for you to share wealth of information and knowledge about IGeneX and about Lyme testing in general. So it'd be great to start with a quick introduction about yourself, your role at IGeneX, and then we'll dive into some of this amazing knowledge you're here to share with us.
Hi, Erica. Yes, thank you so much for having me. I feel like you have the more interesting story to share, but I'm happy to be here. So my role at IGeneX is basically co-supervisor for the customer service department, and I also work in the marketing department as a marketing associate. We're quite a small company, and so everyone wears many hats, and so you end up learning a lot about the different aspects of the company. And being in customer service, we engage with patients a lot, as well as doctors. And so you hear their stories, and it makes you want to learn more and be able to empathize with what patients are going through, because it's so difficult. And most of them don't find out what they have, or if it's Lyme disease or tick-borne disease, until it's been years later, which I know You're familiar with that.
Absolutely. I was unfortunately one of those as well. I was actually considered lucky, I suppose, that I actually found out within 2 years, and I was lucky to have a doctor test me with IGeneX labs and find out that I was CDC positive. But I know so many other people can go decades before they even get the proper testing to find out what's been causing their health issues. And it's such a long road of quick deterioration. So I'll share a little bit about my story. I got Lyme disease after my third camping trip to Yosemite, third camping trip of my life. I just happened to be in Yosemite. And it was after that that I had a weird flu that would kind of come and go. And for 2 years, I went doctor to doctor trying to figure out what was wrong with me. I got a plethora of different misdiagnosis, or I guess you could say they were actually diagnosis, but it wasn't my root cause. I was diagnosed with celiac disease, alopecia, heavy metals, mold, food allergies, Hashimoto's, all these things, which I did end up having, but Lyme was really my root cause. And it was just so surprising to me that it took 2 years for my doctor to finally test me for it. And, I remember the day that we tested, I was sitting in his office and I just started crying. I was like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't think. I can barely drive. I'm running stop signs, forgetting my way home. I can't work. I can't exercise. And I was just like, what do you mean my labs are perfect? Like, what do you mean you've tested me? And he said, the only thing we haven't tested you for is Lyme disease and chronic fatigue viruses. And I was like, well, I doubt it's Lyme. I'm like the most city person there is. But I said, test me for it anyways. I'm so desperate to find out. And he did the IGeneX labs, and I was CDC positive. So it's just crazy that it takes so long. And, I'm so thankful that there's a lab like you guys that's able to help people and help get answers, even though it's the start of a second part of a very long journey to get your life back. But so important to have testing that is more accurate and helping people get answers to their health conditions. So speaking of Lyme testing, I want to dive really deep in today on all things Lyme testing. There's so much controversy with Lyme. There's so much controversy about testing not being accurate and not being efficient and working. And so it'd be great if you could share a little bit about IGeneX, how you guys got started in Lyme testing, and what sets you apart from other kinds of Lyme testing out there.
So we've been around for around 30 years. Mm-hmm. IGeneX was originally a company under 3M testing for allergies, and then they changed to Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. And over the years, it's just been evolving because there was a need, and there's been a need because the CDC guidelines haven't improved since 1994, and so there hasn't been anything to help patients or help doctors diagnose Lyme disease and the co-infections, more importantly. And so this is what we specialize in. And it is important to know that it's not just Lyme disease. Patients can have Babesia, Bartonella, or tick-borne relapsing fever. And so we're constantly evolving our testing as well. There's a lot of research, a lot of spending goes back into research just to make sure that our tests are are always the best, and they're always there and just to help people. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It seems like it's a constantly changing terrain. There's always new infections, or, all of a sudden an area that didn't have a certain infection all of a sudden has it, or there's a new strain of Lyme disease. And it just seems like you're always kind of chasing it and trying to stay on top of it. And it's almost changing and adapting faster than we are as people researching it. So we're very thankful for all the research that you do and continued testing.
Yeah, it's important to note that ticks don't need a passport or a visa or permission to go from place to place. They
Absolutely.
can be found in multiple places. And as animals, the host carriers of these ticks and this bacteria, as they spread to other regions, then the diseases spread. And so almost all the diseases are becoming more widespread.
Mm-hmm. What wildlife do you find, or do you have any research in this, that is the kind of animal or transport that spreads it the most? I know there's some people say birds, or some studies have shown birds. Some people have said like squirrels and the white-footed mouse and things like that. Do you have any research or insight into what type of wildlife seems to be the biggest vector and spreader of ticks with Lyme disease and tick-borne illness?
I don't have any specific research, or we don't have any at IGeneX, but based on what I've read personally, I mean, in urban areas, I think it's squirrels, right? Because you find squirrels everywhere, and then white-footed mouse, of course, in the forests, and deer, and birds, all of them, the ones you mentioned.
All of them, yeah,
yeah. And so there's always a new article coming out with a new animal that they think is a spreader, or animals that seem to spread them less.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe introducing those animals into the environment a little.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there was I think it's a lizard. I forget what kind of lizard, but that if ticks bite it, it actually kills the bacteria. I'm like, how do we get more of these guys in the world? I'm like, I want one as a pet.
Article. That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yes. We need more of them, and we need more possums. Exactly. I hear that they like to eat ticks too. So I'm like, those two are my new favorite animals.
Who would think that this tiny little thing would cause so much damage?
I know, especially when you see pictures of the nymphs. I mean, they can be the size of a poppy seed, which, how are you supposed to even see that? I recently saw a picture of a tick in a dog's mouth embedded into the gums, and it was so tiny. And I'm like, how often do you check inside of your dog's mouth? They're lucky that they saw it, but how many times do these just go missed? Or, they can be in your armpits or your scalp. And how do you differentiate that from a speck of your own hair? It's just so traumatizing to see and hear all these stories all the time. But hopefully one day we'll have some more help and more answers for this. So diving in a little bit more, what kind of tests does IGeneX offer, and what kind of tests do you recommend for patients wanting to dig deeper to see if they are, in fact, being afflicted with Lyme or other tick-borne co-infections?
That's a really good question. So it's actually, as a lab, we're not allowed to recommend or tell patients or doctors what to order, but and we can't advise either, but we can go through what we have available. And one of the approaches our lab director really promotes is a panel approach, so we're not just doing direct testing, which are PCRs. We also offer indirect testing, which is the antibodies. So, you have your Western blots. We have immunoblots, which are highly specific and sensitive and actually cover a wider range of species of Borrelia than the Western blots do. And then we have a test called the IGeneX spot for Lyme and Bartonella. And that looks at your T cells. So it's good for really early detection of the disease. Okay. And some patients are seronegative, where they don't produce antibodies. I think there was a number of around 20%. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure if it's the exact number, but it's quite a high percentage of patients who don't produce antibodies. And so it's important that they also have access to testing. And PCRs offer that access. In the case of Babesia and Bartonella, you have FISH testing. And for Bartonella, we have our multi-species Bartonella Western blots that are really useful. And that's a disease that's also on the rise. So it's just having all these different types of
that's a nasty one.
tests.
I had, yeah. So can you talk a little bit, I'm very curious about the early detection, because that's been one of the issues with Lyme is if you do a Lyme test too soon after a bite, your body hasn't had enough time to create those antibodies to even produce accurate results. So can you talk a little bit more about the early detection test? Because I think that's so important. You know, if someone is out on a camping trip and comes back and has a flu in the middle of the summer, that should be something that they should consider testing for right away and get on top of it. So I'd love to hear more about the early detection test.
Exactly. So you touched on something really important there, that it's really good to, to test straight away. Or if you've been bitten by a tick and you see the tick, save it.
Yes.
But back to the early detection test, it's the IGeneX spot. It's similar to the Ellis spot. So it's a T cell test, and it's looking at cellular response, cellular immune response, whereas the antibody test is looking at a humoral immune response. And so it's one of those tests that when you've been bitten and after a few days, you can get tested up to probably the first month. And then it's also a good test for later on in the disease in the chronic stages. So basically.
So can you use it for someone, I mean, oh, go ahead.
Sorry? No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, can you use it for someone, say like me, if I know I've done a test since being in remission and I tend to come up positive because it's an antibody test. So I actually probably want to be positive to show that I still have antibodies to it and that my immune system is catching it. But would I be a good candidate for doing maybe this other test to see what my T cell response is, or to see how much of the Lyme I have? Or is that not something that would apply in the situation?
So actually, I'm not too sure about that. That would be something that a doctor would advise on. I know it's good for a chronic stage. It's a good test to do in the chronic stage. I just don't know when exactly at that time. I know the IgG antibodies, though, are known to show past infection. And so that might be a more applicable test. Yeah.
Great. And then can you talk a little bit about the tests that you offer for the co-infections too? I know you touched on that there's a couple different ones for Bartonella. What are some of the other co-infections? You know, there's probably over 20, 25 co-infections, you know, like the Powassan virus, and obviously Babesia and Bartonella are the most common. But can you touch on a couple of the other co-infections and your testing approach for those as well?
Yeah, sure. So the diseases that we test for at IGeneX, besides Lyme, are tick-borne relapsing fever, Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, and Rickettsia. And so for all of them, we have the antibody tests. For tick-borne relapsing fever, we have the immunoblots like we do for Lyme disease. And then for Bartonella, we have multi-species Bartonella Western blots. And then for Babesia, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, and Rickettsia, we have the IFA tests, which are looking specifically at a certain species. So in Babesia's case, you're looking at Babesia duncani and Babesia microti. And then when it comes to, and that's an indirect test because it's an antibody test as well. And then for Babesia and Bartonella, we also do the FISH testing, which stands for fluorescence in situ hybridization, and it's looking at the RNA. And that's actually a really effective test for Babesia because it's looking at it at the genus level. So you're not just looking at a specific species, but you're encapsulating more. And yeah, and it looks at active infection. So it sounds
like you have different kinds of tests. So it sounds like you have different kinds of tests depending on the microbe because they all come up a little bit differently or need to be tested differently.
So treatment would be different in testing.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the PCR test? I know, there's a lot of controversy with the CDC saying that a PCR test should not be used and that you should use the ELISA test, which really misses over 50% of Lyme cases. And then there's the Western blot. Can you talk a little bit about the three different kinds of tests, how they're similar, how they differ, and how one might pick up something that the other one is missing?
Sure. So an ELISA test is just not very specific, and I mean, it's been proven over and over again to be quite ineffective. The PCR test is a direct test because it's looking at the DNA of the bacteria or the parasite. And the CDC doesn't say not to do a PCR, but I think they discourage it mainly because the sensitivity can be quite low. But then you're also ruling out and you're missing out on patients who may not produce antibodies. And so to have, to do all types of testing, you're getting a better result or a better, you're having more of an idea of what might be wrong with you. And the Western blots, so the Western blots are antibody tests, and they're looking at either recent acute exposure with the IgM antibodies, or long-term chronic exposure with the IgG antibodies. However, we've come out with the immunoblots, which we say is the equivalent of doing 7 or 8 Western blots each. And we find that those are a lot more effective because we only came out with them in October 2017. And they're really good tests because you're not just looking at Borrelia burgdorferi B31 or 297. You're looking at several species of Borrelia that could cause Lyme disease, and they're highly sensitive.
There's over 300 strains that we know about.
Yeah, we don't know how many infect humans and how and where. And so these cover species from not just the US, but Asia and Europe as well. And so it's pretty inclusive. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, it's good to hear that there is a test that is expanding and looking at all those different strains and trying to be more sensitive so that it can help pick up some of these things in patients that are trying to find answers. And so I have one question. Is there anything IGeneX recommends doing before testing? I know, there's another Lyme test on the market, the DNA connections test, and they sometimes recommend doing some strenuous exercise or getting a deep tissue massage before the test to try to kind of drive out some of the Lyme and get a more accurate test. Is there anything that IGeneX recommends before you're doing any of your tests to try to get as accurate as a result as possible?
So as a lab, we try not to recommend anything when it comes to that area because that really is the doctor's expertise. And that is your provider's, that would be overstepping as well. And so it is something that they have to let you know what makes sense, and because it interferes with their treatment, basically. But one thing we do encourage is if you're looking at Lyme disease, it's prudent to also consider tick-borne relapsing fever because it's caused by Borrelia.
I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, it's caused by Borrelia just like Lyme is, but a different group of species of Borrelia. And so the symptoms are so similar. So we used to have this flyer that we'd send out and it would say, looks like Lyme, seems like Lyme, symptoms are like Lyme, but it's not Lyme. So people would get tested for Lyme disease and it would come back negative and they'd insist they have Lyme disease, even though the symptoms are so similar to anything else you could have because they overlap. But you'd always have that one thing that would differentiate and tell you, no, it's Lyme disease. And it turns out that it could be tick-borne relapsing fever. And so it might be just as widespread or more widespread than Lyme disease. And so it's really important to consider testing for tick-borne relapsing fever and to look at it as borreliosis as a whole. So not just when you're thinking of Lyme, think of borreliosis. And tick-borne relapsing fever can be caused by a hard tick in like Lyme disease, and that's Borrelia miyamotoi, but primarily by soft ticks, so the ornithodorus ticks. And those could be found anywhere. And they have a faster rate of infection. Basically, it can take a much shorter time to get infected with the disease once the tick has bitten you, because I think hard ticks, nobody knows for sure. It varies. Everybody says a different number from 3 hours to
Mm-hmm.
24 hours to 36 hours. And for soft ticks, it
Mm-hmm.
can be up to
Mm-hmm.
15 minutes and you can be infected.
Wow.
And so it's just
Man,
being more
makes you never
aware,
want to go
honestly.
outside.
Yeah, but I think just being more aware and doing a tick check is so important. And there are ways to be careful. And getting the tick tested is honestly one of the best ways to find out whether
Yes.
you need to go further with treatment or what your next steps should be.
Absolutely. And that's one of the questions I have been wanting to talk with you about, get into depth a little bit on. I always tell people, if you have the bad luck of getting bit by a tick, but you have the good luck of seeing that you got bit by a tick, make sure to save it and send it in for testing. So I would love to hear a little bit about the process, how that works. You recommend that they put some grass or keep it wet in there? I've heard like so many different recommendations on how to do it, but I would love to hear from the professionals. What is the process if you have a tick and you want to send it in for testing? What should people do? How long does it take? And what is the whole recommendation from IGeneX on that process?
Okay, so the main recommendation is to get the tick tested, regardless of how old it is, where you found it. Try and remember where you found it. That's actually pretty useful. It's important to note that we
Mm-hmm.
don't identify the ticks, so we don't see what species there are. But if you're able to get it identified by a local vector control, that would be useful, so you can narrow down what diseases you should test it for. And we test the tick for all the diseases that we do human testing on. And so the main thing is to make sure you don't put it in formaldehyde or don't put alcohol on the tick. Just leave it as it is. Put it in a
Okay.
Ziploc bag. Make sure it's sealed properly. And then there's a form to fill out, a tick test request form on our website. You just print, fill out, and send in with the tick. And the tick testing takes around 7 to 10 business days because it is a PCR. And the nature of these PCRs they just take quite a bit of time to process. And you want to get a good test. And so if you're concerned while you're waiting, even if you're not symptomatic and you want to be proactive to counter anything, definitely seek advice from your doctor on whether you should be on a precautionary dose of antibiotics or, just something to help in the meantime. And then hopefully that tick is negative. But,
Yes. Hope so.
Yeah. But the tick, if it's positive, then at least you've got your answers and you know where to go next,
Yep.
and you know what diseases to
Mm-hmm.
focus on as well.
So I do have a question. Even in my own Lyme journey, when I finally did IGeneX test and I went to a primary care doctor, which was just in denial that I even had Lyme, that Lyme even existed in California. And then when I told her that I tested positive with IGeneX, she just scoffed at me. So why is there so much kind of misinformation amongst doctors and denial to want to use a better testing? Why do they all insist on wanting to use the ELISA testing, which we know is unreliable? Like, why is there such resistance from the medical community that is not open-minded to want to use a more reliable Lyme test?
So it's really unfortunate, actually. I wish, excuse me, I really wish tick-borne diseases weren't such a controversial topic and everybody could just get on board and know that it's about helping the patients and trying to improve testing in multiple places, not just having us as the one source. Of course, we like knowing that we can help people, but there needs to be more. And so I think it's because the CDC guidelines are so outdated that they haven't been updated since 1994. And a lot of people go off of the CDC recommendations. And a lot of doctors go off of the CDC recommendations. And so there's this rumor that IGeneX has too many positives. And I was like, that's not actually true. And so it's unfortunate that there's that rumor out there because it's not a fact. It's so far from the truth. We just know that our testing is good and we're trying to help people and it's something we're constantly working on. I mean, even right now, we're working on new testing for some of the other co-infections just to make sure that we're constantly updating what we have out there and that people have access to the best testing. And so um, one of the other reasons why it's difficult to use this as well is cost. And we understand that. It's just we are a small company and we don't bill insurance except Medicare Part B. And so if more insurance companies were on board, then maybe, it could be more accessible to people as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's, it's crazy. They're like, oh, there's too many positives, but people don't realize what a gigantic epidemic this is and how large scale it is. And, one thing that every time I see people that either say that they have some other kind of condition or, probably a misdiagnosis because their doctors haven't dove deep to do the right testing to uncover that it's Lyme. And, I'm wondering, has IGeneX done any kind of research to offer Lyme testing through a doctor or worked with some kind of doctor to test some people that maybe have been diagnosed with like MS or fibromyalgia or ALS and RA, all those things that can be underlying Lyme. And I even recently saw a JAMA study that said ALS patients were 5 times more likely to test positive for Lyme disease. So I think there's a big pool of misdiagnosis going on here. And it's unfortunate that doctors, are in denial about using the proper testing or even open-minded to exploring some of this testing and really diving into this, underlying root cause that could be making a lot of people sick.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, misdiagnosis is such a huge problem when it comes to tick-borne diseases because you're trying to, it should be one of those things that's considered initially, not later on. So it's not something that years down the line you're like, oh, this is something we haven't tried. Let's test for Lyme now. Instead of initially, you should be like, no, your symptoms do as broad as they are, they fit Lyme disease or even just a little bit. And so, as you said, it's such an epidemic that it's definitely something that should be considered initially. And as well as that, it's I know it's also the tests out there that are available for commercial use are not always what's going to get you the best answer because they're using these old guidelines or the ELISA tests that are not as effective. And so one thing we've come out with to try and make it a little more affordable and accessible is the broad coverage tests for Lyme and tick-borne relapsing fever. And they go at $195 each. But they're similar to the immunoblots. They don't distinguish between IgM and IgG, but they do cover a wide range of species of Borrelia that cause both diseases. And so they're really worth considering and something that doctors who don't typically want to use us because maybe it's too costly or we don't bill insurance, maybe that's an option for them.
Okay, great. That's good to know that there is something becoming more available so that more people have access to that.
Exactly. And one of the things you're talking about was, sorry. You were talking about misdiagnosis. So like with ALS and fibromyalgia. So we do studies sometimes if a doctor approaches us and is like, hey, I've had a lot of patients who seem to be exhibiting symptoms similar to Lyme we'll start a study. But that's usually something that's done between our research department and specifically our lab director and the doctors directly. And it's not one where, the patients have to opt to be in the study. You don't know their names. And so there's no results given out.
Gotcha.
So it's just more of a voluntary basis where they're trying to help with research. And so one of the ones we did do was with Morgellons. And there is a paper on our website that we released based off of that study and showing the connection with Lyme disease.
Yeah, I'd love to check that out because that's another one that, oh my gosh, the denial on that is even worse than Lyme. And it just seems that people dealing with that are suffering so much and just they have less help than anybody, even in the Lyme community. It's so devastating.
It really is.
I'm going to check that out for sure. I'm going to make sure to link to that as well so that people can check that out. So does IGeneX collect any sort of data for positivity rates on like where patients are located or where these tests are coming in, to have any sort of data to know like in this area, this infection is more endemic than this area? I mean, I know someone can have traveled and gotten bitten somewhere else, so it's not 100%, as
Yeah.
testing ticks in the area, or some other kind of data source. But just curious if you collect any sort of data to know if certain areas are more endemics for certain strains or, pathogens in that area.
So we try to, but it's not something that we have available or accessible.
Okay.
Some of it is proprietary, but we try to gather this data to help people and just to know what they could have come across.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in California, tick-borne relapsing fever is so rife, and then a lot of people don't know this, and there's a lot of deniers of this as well, of the existence of Babesia duncani on the East Coast. But it really is there. And, we've found ticks that are positive for Babesia duncani on the East Coast. And so that's, that's some of the data that we've come up with. And something the CDC came out with was the spread of rickettsia, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And just that's spreading
Which is
more westward, and
another nasty one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, here in California, we're both located here in California, but there's just such a big denial that Lyme even exists here. I got Lyme here in California in Yosemite. I just saw a study recently that they tested ticks in, Central Coast in Northern California on the beaches, and that there were ticks with Lyme disease. And I kind of feel like I already knew this because I was diagnosed with Lyme up in the Northern California area, and I would sit in the IV room with other Lyme patients, and most of them had gotten it at the beaches in San Francisco or, Santa Cruz area. Like, I already knew it and was always very cautious about it, but it's, here we are 8 years later, there's finally a study on it and saying, hey, we have a problem, it's not just in the East Coast. And, even in Orange County, I did recently, about a year ago, did a volunteer event with Global Lyme Alliance down there, and meeting so many people in the Orange County area that either had seen a tick or been bitten by a tick. And I'm like, this is crazy. You don't think that Southern California has these issues in these arid, hot, dry climates, but they're everywhere, and a bird just needs to drop them off, or wildlife moves them around. So why do you think there's so much denial in some of these other places? And has IGeneX ever considered working with agencies to show some of these positive tests and cases and say, hey, look, we do have a problem, or joining with agencies that do some of this additional testing in the field to kind of populate your resources and data, and, shed more light on the prevalence of this in other parts of the country?
Oh, definitely. So anytime, we're approached saying, because it's really difficult to change these agencies' minds. And doctors, especially in the southern states, they like to deny that Lyme exists there. And it's just not the case. We found it in all 50 states, including Hawaii. And so, and Alaska. So, Lyme doesn't discriminate against where it's going. And California is one of the hotbeds. Most of our business comes from California, not the East Coast. And so, especially the Bay Area over here, there's so much Lyme and tick-borne relapsing fever and Babesia and Bartonella. And so I don't quite understand where all the denial's coming from, instead of trying to, help and fix the issues. But I read that article as well about the beaches and the coastal environments, basically. And yeah, we get a lot of ticks from like the Santa Cruz County, Santa Clara County to test out San Francisco. And that hasn't slowed down.
Yeah, it's interesting you said Hawaii too, because that always seems like a safer place, that isn't as prevalent. And I mean, I don't know if it's still true, but they used to say that Antarctica was the only place that didn't have ticks. And I'm like, is that where we're going to have to go, to Antarctica, to avoid them?
Oh my
Have you gotten
goodness.
any tests from Antarctica yet?
No, not that
Okay.
I know of, actually.
We still have a safe place then.
Right. Yeah, but so many people don't remember getting bitten. And so I think that's what takes longer. It's like you don't think that you got bitten because you don't remember it. And by the time you get around to figuring out what's going on, it could be too late, or it's already become a chronic problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Most people don't get the rash. I think they say somewhere between 30 to 50% get the rash. The ticks, like we talked about earlier, are just so tiny. The chances of seeing it and where they like to hide and feed is so small, so it's like the lucky ones are the ones that get the rash and recognize it as a Lyme rash, because it's not always a bullseye either. It can be a kind of strange bite. I'm pretty sure my bite happened on my hand, and after the trip I had a weird bite, but I thought it was just a spider bite. I used to get mosquito bites all the time. I knew nothing about Lyme. Then Lyme was just like this East Coast disease that, we didn't have to deal with out here. And it didn't even cross my mind to think about it, and that's what this bite could have been. So if I had more awareness, known more about the disease, I might have, had a little bit of insight into thinking, hey, maybe this is something, a big deal. This is a big issue. So hindsight is 2020, and here we are now. The most I can do is spread as much information, share as much knowledge, and if I even just save one person, I feel like I've accomplished so much. So that's why I love to share my story, share awareness, especially for Lyme Disease Awareness Month this month, doing a big campaign. And people might get sick of hearing it from me, but if we can save at least one person, we've done good in the world. So hopefully a lot more than that.
Yeah. Never sick of hearing that. That's definitely where it's at. Just
absolutely.
Honestly, it's awareness, just raising awareness. The number of people that don't know anything about, most people have heard of Lyme disease, but they don't consider it as something that's ever affected them. But then all the other co-infections just sound so foreign. And so it's raising awareness about those as well, and knowing that you can be infected with a co-infection without having Lyme disease.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really feel like we need to shift away from calling it Lyme disease, because it really should just be tick-borne infection, because it's, like you said, so encompassing, and you might not have Lyme, but you have 5 other co-infections, which are just as debilitating, or you have all of them, so it's not, people need to realize it's not just one disease. When you get bitten by a tick, you have the possibility of getting up to 20 diseases, really, depending on what it had, maybe even more. So, I think there really needs to be a shift in awareness and how we talk about it and refer to it, and really talk about everything.
And it affects everyone differently, that you can't discount how somebody's feeling because they have a tick-borne disease and maybe they're not exhibiting symptoms like somebody who's really going through a tough time, because later on it might affect them that same way. And so, it's just about making sure that the awareness is also with those who are living with this, not just the risk of getting it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is awesome. I want to dive in a little bit. I know you guys just started offering some testing with COVID too, and I'd love to hear a little bit about how IGeneX got into that, how you see an overlap with Lyme testing and COVID testing, and also, I'm very intrigued to learn a little bit more about your vaccine response panel. I think that is a pretty awesome test that you're offering, especially for people that are immunocompromised, that are getting the vaccine. I know there's been a lot of studies and stories coming out that maybe the vaccine is not as protective for people that are immunocompromised. So I'd love to hear you share a little bit about that and some of the science and technology behind that new test that you're offering.
So one of the first things we did was take our immunoblots that we have for Lyme disease and tick-borne relapsing fever and convert it so that we're able to test for COVID. And so we're able to test IgM and IgG antibodies in patients. And that test has been out for over a year now. But it's really more important now, as people are getting the vaccines, to see whether they are producing the antibodies. And then we can use our IGeneX spot test for COVID as well, the one that we have for Lyme and Bartonella, to see if they're producing that initial response. So that cellular response, the T cell. And if you're producing T cells, then you know your vaccine is working as well. So we've released it. We've just launched a panel, which is in loose terms being called a vaccine response panel. But it's a panel to basically see how your antibodies are responding to the vaccine. And, if you've had COVID before as well, whether that affects your antibodies. And so, but what we have been doing since last year is helping our local community, so in Santa Clara County, through the local Milpitas Fire Department, and then also helping some national teams, nursing homes, schools, get tested on a regular basis so they can keep up with their activities. And that's been the RT-PCR test. And one of the main things we managed to do is offer a really quick turnaround time. So if somebody is suspected of being positive at a nursing home, for example, they can get a test within the same day or early the next day from when they drop off the sample, and take action right away to make sure the rest of their facility is safe. And then we've also been offering testing for people traveling as well, and just making sure they have the right paperwork to satisfy their travel requirements. And that's been good, because you want people to be able to travel safely.
Yes.
And not spread it while they're traveling.
Oh God,
and right now it's really difficult because a lot of the world is shut down or locked down again.
But hopefully this is something that can help things reopen a little bit and do it safely. And
exactly.
If someone wanted to do the vaccine response panel, what's the best way to do that? Is that something you do through your doctor that they order and do it, or can they order it directly through you?
It's something you have to do through your doctor.
Okay.
And so your doctor would request a kit. We'd send that out, and then, your doctor would request the kit. Then we'd send that out, and the patient can get tested.
Great. And how much does that panel run?
I believe it's $395.
Okay. Good to know.
It's very new. Yes. It's just launched at the end of April.
Excellent.
We're excited to see how people respond, and how they feel, and it's just giving you peace of mind as well, knowing that.
Yeah, especially because we don't know how long the vaccines are good for. So it might be something that, if you're debating getting a booster, if that becomes a thing, maybe you can do this test and be like, do I really need it, or is my current vaccine still working? And it might be a helpful way to gauge where your body is at with your existing vaccine. So I think this is great. This is going to give people a lot of information, especially people that don't necessarily want to jump into additional vaccines. So very, very interesting. And so, this is great. Is there anything else that you'd love to share about IGeneX or about Lyme testing in general? Otherwise, I want to turn it around and let you ask me any questions as well. I know you were interested in some of my story, my own personal Lyme journey and testing. So if you don't have anything else to share, or if you do, feel free. And then if not, I will turn it around and see if I can answer anything for you.
So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think it's the most important thing when it comes to Lyme disease, tick-borne diseases, is just making sure you increase your awareness, test the tick, and if you're lucky to get the tick. Otherwise, just don't discount your symptoms. We have a symptom checker on our website as well under the resources tab. That's been a Lyme literature doctor helped produce it, and so it's really good, and it's a good guide for your doctor if they're a little unsure. And so the resources are there. Don't be afraid to call us. We empathize with what patients are going through. And I know Global Lyme Alliance has a good peer-to-peer program where, patients need to talk to someone. And,
absolutely. And I'll link to all these resources as well. So to make it easy for people to find these great resources that are out there.
And then also like Bay Area Lyme Foundation, LymeDisease.org, iLads, they're all really,
Hmm.
really good resources. And, everyone's just trying to
Yes.
get in together and help, and the Lyme Disease Association as well.
Great.
But yeah, no,
Yes, those are all great.
I don't really have so too much to add. Just thank you so much for having me. I'm so interested in your story. It's amazing how taken Lyme disease and turned it into a positive for yourself.
Hmm.
Um, but do you remember being bitten? Did you remember seeing the tick?
It's interesting. Hindsight is 2020, and I remember on that camping trip, I was sitting on like a tree stump, and I remember looking down at my hand and seeing like a little black speck on my hand, and I tried to like brush it off, and it wasn't coming off. And I remember having to use like my fingernail to kind of dig it out, and I freaked out for a second, and I was just like, and I had this thought to myself. I freaked out because I had to dig it out with my nail, and I said, Erica, don't freak out. A bug that small isn't going to hurt you. And I remember having that thought, and I didn't even think anything of it. After the trip, I had a weird bug bite. Didn't even put the two together. I just was like, oh, I must have gotten bitten by a spider, because it was a big inflamed kind of bite, but I didn't think anything of it. And then like a week later, I got like a flu. But I used to get sick a lot. I was healthy, but I don't think I was super healthy. I had lived in mold before, and you know thought that once I moved, I was fine. But I think that really started to tank my immune system. I was a vegetarian for 10 years, but I compensated by eating more gluten, and I think I've always been sensitive to that. So I was kind of the perfect storm by the time I got Lyme and got bit. And I got that flu, and I was never the same after that. It kind of would come and go for 6 to 8 weeks, and I always felt kind of sick. And then I knew something was really wrong the day that I took a shower and got out of the shower and was drying my hair, and I had a bald spot that literally showed up overnight, probably about this big. Um, and it was alopecia. So I started triggering on a bunch of autoimmune conditions. My immune system was just getting kind of crazy. So that was when I actually went and saw a functional medicine doctor for the first time. That was up in Marin County. And he thought that gluten was my issue. He's like, I'm willing to bet money on it that gluten's your issue, gluten's your trigger. We tested me for celiac disease. I was celiac, highly sensitive to gluten. So he was just like, go on a gluten-free diet. You're going to be better. Did that, didn't get better, started getting sicker, started developing a lot of neurological issues. And, for 2 years, I was on this path with him. We went through so many diagnoses: Hashimoto's, food allergies, metals, like he just didn't know what was wrong with me until that day that I shared earlier in the call that I was just crying in his office. I was like, what's wrong with me? Like, I'm just becoming like a vegetable. Like, I can't do anything. Like, I'm just a shell. And that's when he decided to test me for Lyme. And I was shocked that it was Lyme. And I was trying to piece back, this was in 2012 that I got bit. I've been this is a decade almost to go back and like retrace the steps and find out when it happened, and like when did I start getting sick, when did everything happen. And I remember that weird bug and the weird bug bite afterwards. And if I had been more educated in Lyme or knew to associate those things together, I might have gotten diagnosed sooner. And honestly, I'm lucky that it took less than 2 years. It was just about 2 years that it took to get diagnosed. And I'm thankful that that's all it took, because in working with the Lyme community and working with other people that are sick, some of them it's taken 10, 15, 20 years. Some of them are born with it because their mom had it,
Yeah.
and didn't know she had it when she was pregnant with them, and they're born with it. And children get labeled with like autism or developmental issues, and you wonder how much of that is Lyme and what's going on with them. So I just feel like we have this huge iceberg of things that we haven't even discovered. And I feel like the people that have had Lyme or chronic illness see it, and it's unfortunately going to take more people getting sick to start to really, really notice it. But, I hope before more people get sick and more people get hurt and more people get Lyme and tick-borne diseases, that people can start opening up and having more awareness and, looking out for it.
Yeah, definitely. And you sharing your story is just so important.
Mm-hmm.
You say that you're lucky, that within 2 years, or, after 2 years, you were able to find out what was wrong. But honestly, that's sad that, you should consider 2 years lucky.
Absolutely.
It should be something that's thought
Tested
of
right
much
away.
tested right away. Exactly.
I agree.
And
And
I think,
it makes me frustrated that this doctor, I'm like, you know about Lyme, you use IGeneX, you're already using the right labs. Like, why isn't this one of the first things that you did when I started having cognitive issues or described joint pain or allergies? And he was one of the more educated doctors. He knew the right test to use. He even was open-minded enough to test me for it. But so many people don't have access to those kinds of doctors either. I was lucky that I could afford it. I was lucky that I had doctors like that in my community, but so many people don't even have that access. So how are they ever supposed to get diagnosed with the right test and the right kind of doctor if they don't have those resources? So, it's sad. It's sad that so many people are not going to have access to this.
exactly. And again, it's just so controversial. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not saying that, if you're feeling a certain way, it has to be Lyme or it has to be a tick-borne disease, but it is something that should be considered. It's
Absolutely.
not something that you should wait till much later to consider.
Absolutely. And especially now with a lot of the long COVID, I'm really curious to see what's going on with that. I was on a webinar recently, and a doctor who treats mostly Lyme said she was getting a lot of long COVID patients, with seems like long hauler Lyme symptoms. And she said one of the first things she was doing is testing them with IGeneX, and they were all coming up positive for tick-borne infection. So I wonder how much of it is, people were fine, unfortunately got COVID, and it just set something off in their immune system. So, I think we're going to have a huge epidemic on our hands. If that is true, fortunately, maybe that will start to shed light onto this and cause more awareness and have more scientific breakthroughs so we can help all of these people.
I really
But
hope
I'm
so.
really scared if that's the
Yeah.
case because,
Yes.
this is going to be very difficult and hard for people. But hopefully something good comes of it. So we'll see.
And then I noticed that you talked about your celiac
Mm-hmm.
intolerance, and so you changed your diet to help deal with Lyme disease. How did that work? What was the connection between diet and Lyme disease for you?
Diet, I think, is such an overlooked piece of healing, but such an important piece of healing too. A couple things with Lyme disease, you can become allergic to so many foods. So your diet gets very limited. But at the same time, you want to eat foods that are healing you, that are not inflammatory. So I had become allergic to so many foods. And when I got diagnosed with celiac disease, I went on a gluten-free diet, which really is just kind of like a standard American diet of gluten-free version. So very sugary, high in grains, highly processed. And I just felt spacey all the time. I never felt good. So my doctor, the one that ended up diagnosing me, he was a little savvier than most and recommended the autoimmune paleo diet. So I did that. It was a very, very strict elimination diet, cutting out anything that can cause inflammation in your body and slowly adding those things back in. And it changed my life. I felt so much better. Some of my symptoms went away. I had more energy, and I really started to notice a connection of how food makes you feel and how food can cause a lot of these symptoms too. And I think, especially in the Lyme community, it's really easy for people to blame everything on Lyme or blame everything on the co-infections, but so many foods can cause symptoms similar to it. So, for example, with gluten, if I get accidentally glutened, I don't get any digestive issues like people associate with it. I get all neurological issues, which could really overlap with a lot of my neurological Lyme issues that I used to have. Like, I get occipital neuralgia headache that lasts for 7 days. I get anxiety, insomnia, like dark thoughts. I get kind of jittery, like my nerves just kind of feel frazzled. I get neuropathy, fatigue and joint pain. And that's so similar to what I had with Lyme too. So, when I'm not glutened, it's like night and day difference in how I feel. And it's I just think food is so important, and I can tell with like other things too. Now that I've recovered and I'm in remission, like I definitely indulge on some gluten-free treats or sugar, like not optimal foods here and there. 95% of the time I eat super clean, but you got to live a little bit too, right? So, but I
Yeah,
notice
of
that I
course.
don't feel good when I eat those things. Fortunately, I recover very quickly and I don't do it every day. But, for someone that's trying to heal and still eating some of those bad foods or inflammatory foods, if you're trying to be on this treadmill that you're not keeping up with. Like, how are you going to get better if you're eating suboptimal foods every other day that are causing inflammation and causing these symptoms? You're never going to get out of it. So I think when you're healing, it's very, very important to be strict. When you heal, you're able to reintroduce a lot more foods. You're able to eat things again. You're able to have those cheat days on the things that don't affect you too negatively. Like, I would never cheat with gluten, but I'll cheat on like sugar or a gluten-free cookie or something, So things like that. And I think once you start learning how the foods affect you, it also kind of strengthens that muscle with like other things. You start to notice if you're in an environment that, is affecting you, or people that are affecting you, or like if you're in a moldy place, or, just certain things. You start to like notice things more and communicate better with your body. And the same thing with food. You're like, when I eat this, I feel really energized and clear-headed. When I eat this, I want to take a nap. And you start to notice what works and what doesn't. And the more you feel good when you eat good foods, the more you want to eat that way, that you don't even really want to eat the bad foods anymore. So
I was looking at some of your recipes that you've put up, and I was just like, these look so good, especially the Patagonia lamb and the roasted cauliflower, the yuca truffle fries. I was just like, those look amazing.
Yes, and that's the thing. You can eat healthy and you don't have to feel deprived. I try to keep things very simple, very fresh. When you're using high quality ingredients, you don't need to slather things in sauces and all these other seasonings and things. You can keep things very fresh, use some fresh herbs, some good healthy fats and oil, and your food's delicious. You're not even going to miss some of that other stuff. And then you'll eat that other stuff and you'll be like, oh, why did I do this? Why didn't I just make my own food and eat something healthy?
Oh, that's awesome. It's so good. It's amazing that you're able to find this connection and realize how diet affects you when it comes to Lyme disease. I know a lot of people are not lucky to recognize that connection, and so it takes them a lot longer to recover. And so your resource is great, and just having your blog out there and, raising awareness and letting people know that, this is something to be aware of as well. And as you said, like a lot of people who have tick-borne diseases become really reliant on blaming it on that tick-borne disease, and not just like, what can I do to make this a better situation?
Absolutely. And diet's something that everybody can do. You don't necessarily need a doctor. I work as a health coach and help people with diet. So, you can work with someone like that that's a little bit more cost effective and can help guide you and spend more time with you. And so it's something that everyone can do without having another appointment or expense. It's like, you can start just cleaning up your diet and finding what foods really fuel you and make you feel good.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining too. I'm so excited to share this with my audience. And then also want to remind everyone that we have our IG Live on May 12th at 5:30 Pacific. So I'm going to open that up to the community to be able to ask questions and also share our interview for today too.
Perfect. Thank you.